If somebody held a gun to my head and predicted who would win this election, I would not have predicted Tsai a year ago today.
How you evaluate President Tsai's performance is highly correlated after Hong Kong protests. Everything goes up.
To be clear, China is trying to infiltrate Taiwan.
Okay, so welcome to Critical Vote, a Taiwan post-election roundtable. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of Taiwan Studies here at the Jackson School, and I'm honored to help MC tonight's event. So before we begin, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes telling you about our Taiwan Studies program. Okay, so what is the Taiwan Studies program? We have a mission of promoting research and education on Taiwan society, history, and culture. Our program objectives are threefold. We have public programs like this one. Regular academic lectures and public roundtables are included in this. We have an education mission, which includes both undergraduate and graduate courses. And we're also a global knowledge center, serving as a place for students, scholars, and the public to produce new knowledge about Taiwan. I'll tell you a little bit about each of these. So our public programs, recent events that we've had. Last year we had a major roundtable, the Taiwan Relations Act at 40, for which some of our audience members and faculty members are here as well. We've had a number of book talks on new books in Taiwan Studies, including Professor Paul Barclay's new book, Outcast of Empire, as well as Professor Lan Peijia's new book, Raising Global Families. We have an exciting book lecture coming up next quarter. Professor Julia Strauss from SOAS will be talking about her new book, State Formation in China and Taiwan, and she'll be focusing on the early 1950s, how the Kuomintang consolidated its state capacity in Taiwan. We also have a number of courses, including some exciting new courses for this academic year. Professor Wen, who is in the audience somewhere over here, so Dr. Wen runs our new Study Abroad program, Exploring Environmental and Social Resilience, and she will offer again in the summer. So if you're interested in taking a summer Study Abroad course, please feel free to talk to her. I'm offering my annual Modern Taiwanese History course next winter. And we are excited to have a new course, Science, Technology, Innovation in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. And we also have potentially a new course on comparative East Asian economies. And of course, my graduate seminar on making modern Taiwan will also be taught in the autumn. So if you're interested in these courses, feel free to let me know. And finally, we are a program that's dedicated to making sure that Taiwan Studies grows as a field. And this year we were very honored, or actually it's last year I guess. Last year we were very honored to host the North America Taiwan Studies Association annual conference. And so this brought together about 100 scholars of Taiwan Studies, including many students working at the forefront of new research. We also have an interesting slate of upcoming conferences. We have a small workshop called Landscape in Taiwan. So Professor Jeff Ho and I are helping to run this with a couple of our PhD students. We're very excited to be hosting the very major World Congress of Taiwan Studies, which is a joint production between the European Association of Taiwan Studies, North American Association, and the Japan Association of Taiwan Studies. That'll be held here in the summer of 2021, I believe in June, is that right? Yeah, late June. And finally, we will have one more of these small workshops on labor and migration in Taiwan. If you're interested in learning more, visit our website. We have lots of information on there. You'll see our upcoming events. You'll see all of our past events. We have little short write-ups that Eric and Jensen, our two assistants, help write. And you can also find out more about the courses and about the students and faculty as part of the program. And also feel free to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You'll get event updates that way, and you'll also see some of the different things that we're trying to do with our program. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and start introducing our speakers for today. So we're very honored to have 3 speakers come to Seattle to talk about the very recent presidential elections. 2 of them just flew in from Taipei and are suffering from jet lag, no doubt. So very much appreciate this. And of course, appreciate the audience coming out in such a maybe not so great weather. So appreciation all around. First we have Kars Templeman. So Kars earned his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. He's currently an advisor to the Hoover Program on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific at Stanford University, and previously served as the program manager of the Taiwan Democracy Project at the Freedom Spokely Institute at Stanford. His recent work includes research on Taiwan's parties and elections, defense budgets and security strategy, indigenous minorities, and the strengths and weaknesses of Taiwan's democratic institutions in the face of Chinese influence campaigns. Next up, we also have Liu Zhongwen Dennis. So Dennis is an assistant professor of political science at San Luis State University, deputy coordinator of Conference Group of Taiwan Study, and an international research fellow at the Center for Southeast Asia Studies at National Zhengzhou University. His current research and teaching interests are in the fields of comparative politics, East and Southeast Asian politics, political behavior, and survey research. And finally, we have Maggie Lewis, who's a professor of law at Seton Hall University. She has been a Fulbright Senior Scholar at National Taiwan University, a visiting professor at Academia Sinica, a team member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow with the National Committee on United States-China Relations. Her research includes Taiwan's legal institutions, rule of law, and human rights. Now, before I turn over the roundtable to our guests, we also are very honored to have Director General Alex Fan from the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office here in Seattle. And so we'll let him speak for a couple minutes about the presidential elections, and then we'll hand it over to our three esteemed speakers. So please join me in welcoming Director General Fan, Dr. Templeman, Lewis.
Thank you, James. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here, to be part of this roundtable. When we received the invitation from the Taiwan Study of Washington University, we are very happy to be here. Because the first time I saw the invitation, wow, on the 13th, just 2 days after the election. But actually, we are not the first discussion about this election. Maybe some of you have learned that our office in DC, they held discussion at the same day, but just because of the time difference. So they have this kind of advantage. But anyway, I'm very happy we are, my colleague VP is with me. We are very happy to be here. I want to thank Taiwan Study to host this roundtable. Well, this is the 7th time for this general election for people to elect our president directly. And this is, in Taiwan we had 3 times of power transition, all smoothly, without any difficulty. So why, I saw an article say that why a small country like Taiwan arouse so much attention about their presidential election. I think later we'll listen to the experts why we arouse this kind of attention to the world. However, this election create several barriers for the future people to break. Excuse me. Like everybody knows that President Tsai got 8.17 million votes. That's a record breaking. And she got almost 57.2% of the vote, almost 20% to the runners. And that kind of success is really remarkable. Since as the government representative here, I think all those things, everybody here, you understand more or less. We would like to listen to the experts. But what I'm going to stress that is that the closeness between Taiwan, Republic of China, with the United States. Taiwan is actually very close with US and also Washington State, more precisely. Taiwan is the number 11 or 12 largest trading partner with the United States, give and take, because of the fluctuation or different years. And we are the number 6 or 7 largest trading partner with the state of Washington. So you can see that it's very close relation. And the first person President Tsai received after the election is Mr. Brent Christensen, the director of AIT Taipei office. That's your representative, the chief representative in Taiwan. During their conversation, of course, Mr. Christensen congratulated the president winning about this election. And they also exchanged a lot of opinions. So we can say that after this election, the relations between Taiwan and the United States has escalated from a mere bilateral cooperation partner to a global cooperation partner. Because during their conversation, they stressed the cooperation not only between two sides, but also Indo-Pacific and some other areas were, if possible. The most important framework is called Global Cooperation Training Framework, GCTF. That is a framework we have been doing quite maturely. The items including the GCTF, like women empowerment, law enforcement, environmental protection, and some others. So that's a very good sign for us to have this kind of a closer cooperation. And during when the election, when we had the result of the election, President Tsai spoke in the winning speech. She mentioned about 4 items, actually. Well, if we say in Mandarin or in Chinese, that's 8 words, but 2 issues, just peace, parity, democracy, and the dialogue. Because all the reporters, especially international reporters, they are very curious about the attitude for the new government towards mainland China. So we can say that President Tsai has rendered the olive branch to China. But the reaction up to now from Chinese state government, they still maintain the old theory, one country, 2 systems, and the Taiwan issue is a core value for Chinese. But I think the most important part is that China has never seriously considered the existence of the Republic of China, Taiwan. They should rethink after this election, because so many people vote with President Tsai's position. That shows a strong support, especially for the younger generation. They don't want the incident happening in Hong Kong to happen in Taiwan. So that's a very, very strong voice for the younger generation. Well, I don't want to take too much time. I just want to thank Taiwan Study and listen to our experts, what they have to say. And wish everybody has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Karis Templeman. I want to thank James Lin for inviting me and the rest of us to join the Taiwan Studies program for an interesting night of discussion about the just concluded Taiwan election. Actually, you weren't in Taiwan, were you? You came back before the election. election. Dennis was back before the election, so he missed the actual voting, but all three of us have been in Taiwan recently, and both Maggie and I came back just yesterday. So I apologize if I make less sense than normal, because the jet lag really is starting to kick in, and I'll try to, I've made slides so that I can at least be somewhat coherent this evening. But we had a great visit there, and Maggie and I were part of a group that went to both the major party headquarters as well as some of the smaller parties. We observed the voting and the counting, went to the Central Election Commission where they collate the votes and release the final totals. And then we went to some after-election parties as well. And so we got a good sense of election season in Taiwan. So we're all going to talk about that election, but we've decided to divvy this up a little bit. I'll do just kind of an overview of the election, both what the major issues were, who the candidates were, and then what happened. And both Dennis and Maggie will drill down a little bit into some of the issues more deeply. All right. So let me jump right in here. What was at stake in this election? Well, both the is that recess? Okay. Both the President of the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the legislature were up for grabs. The President is elected for a 4-year term. There was an incumbent President, Tsai, who was elected first in 2016, and she is a member of the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. In the legislature, Taiwan has a unicameral legislature with 113 seats. There's no Senate or National Assembly anymore. And that's also on a 4-year term. And so these are concurrent elections now. It didn't used to be this way, but it's been this way since 2012. And so voters were actually getting votes for both the legislature and the president at the same time. And to set this up, in 2016, the DPP actually won big. They won, they won the presidency with a record share of the vote, over 56%. And they won a majority in the legislature for the first time, defeating the KMT and ending KMT control of the legislature. So the DPP was the incumbent party in this election, in both for the first time. But the DPP looked like, a year ago at this time, the DPP looked like they might really face a tough re-election challenge. They lost badly in the local 2018 elections in November of 2018. Excuse me. And Tsai Ing-wen's approval rating at this point last year was roughly 20%. So she was going into this election cycle looking like a major underdog. And if somebody held a gun to my head and predicted who would win this election, I would not have predicted Tsai Ing-wen a year ago today. In fact, there was a question about whether she would even be renominated by her own party. It looked that dire. In the 2020 campaign, she eventually was renominated. She faced off against an intra-party challenge from her own premier, William Lai. She eventually fended off that challenge, and in June she was renominated as the DPP's presidential candidate. So that the DPP side cleared up in June. Shortly after that, the KMT nominated the mayor of Kaohsiung, Han Kuo-yu, who was a very unusual candidate by Taiwan standards. He came out of nowhere in the 2018 local elections, was basically dumped into Kaohsiung as a sacrificial candidate. Nobody expected him to win, and then he started using some populist language and talking about how poor and how old Kaohsiung seemed, and really struck a nerve with the voters there. And by the end of the campaign, it was a household name across the island, was quite popular among the KMT base, was being requested to go campaign for other candidates in other places around the island, and then most shockingly actually won in Kaohsiung pretty comfortably. Kaohsiung is traditionally a very DPP or deep green city, and he won 54% of the vote. And so after that election, suddenly it looked like he might be the front runner for the presidency on the KMT side, and in fact he did win the KMT primary. And so we had these two candidates, and then there was a question about whether there would be a third-party candidate or an independent running in the race. And the most prominent, the most obvious, was the mayor of Taipei, Ko Wen-je, who won re-election in 2018, beating both a KMT and a DPP candidate who challenged him, and immediately started talking very seriously like he was going to run. And so he really kind of led us all on almost through the entire summer, and then at the last minute refused to register and instead started his own political party and ran it for the legislature. So we ended up without a Ko Wen-je third-party candidacy in this race. The other potential third-party candidate was Terry Guo. You might know him as the former chairman of Foxconn, which manufactures iPhones. He challenged Han Guoyu in the KMT primary. He lost the primary and then refused to endorse Han, and instead made noises like he was going to run a third-party candidacy. But he got right up to the deadline too, asked Ko Wen-je if he might join him on the VP, in the VP slot in a joint ticket. Ko said no, so Go said no. So we actually didn't get either of them running in the race. Instead, we got a perennial candidate, James Song, who's run for president now 4 different times, 5 if we count 2004 when he was in the VP slot. So we ended up with a kind of classic green versus blue and then Song in the middle sort of race. And so rather than this being kind of a wide open 3-way race, we got a much simpler, effectively a 2-way race. The major issues in the campaign, first and foremost, as with every national election in Taiwan, Taiwan's relationship with the People's Republic of China across the strait is a fundamental issue in the campaign. The kind of precursor to this year's campaign, Xi Jinping gave a speech on January 2nd, commemorating the 40th anniversary of a speech that Deng Xiaoping gave, talking about the PRC's relationship with Taiwan. And while he didn't say anything particularly new in that speech, he did use some language that played very poorly in the Taiwanese electorate, and Tsai Ing-wen came right back and gave a very kind of assertive counter-argument to that speech, and her polling numbers jumped. And so she kind of inserted himself into the campaign really at the beginning of this election year, and the DPP kind of rallied around Tsai when she was nominated, so we ended up with the China factor kind of looming in the background of this campaign, as you might expect. Adding to that, the Hong Kong protests broke out in June, about the time Tsai Ing-wen was nominated, and these really raised the salience in Taiwan of security and sovereignty issues. And so they shifted the campaign onto electoral ground that the DPP was much more comfortable running on than the KMT. And so they really, I think, made a difference in the kind of underlying environment under which this campaign was fought. The economy is always a significant issue in Taiwanese elections. The DPP was vulnerable on the economy in part because they'd introduced some labor reforms and initially introduced reforms that gave workers 2 days off. There was a pushback against that, so they rolled it back a little bit, and they ended up alienating both sides, both pro-business and pro-labor. But the economy was actually growing pretty quickly by relative standards during this period, particularly when you consider that Taiwan is a major trading partner, both the mainland China and the United States, and there's a trade conflict between those two powers right now. So Taiwan has actually, fairly surprisingly, been a big beneficiary of that conflict, and the economy grew faster than projected over this period, which I would argue benefited Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP. Energy and environmental policy have emerged as significant kind of cleavage lines in Taiwan politics. The DPP is trying to phase out nuclear power over the next couple of years. Air pollution is a serious issue in Taiwan, and phasing out nuclear power has meant burning more coal and oil and contributing to air pollution. So there's a debate between the KMT and the DPP about energy policy as well. And then finally, social issues have emerged as another salient issue in the Taiwanese electorate. Most significantly, Taiwan passed same-sex marriage law in the spring of 2019. So Taiwan is the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. And the KMT, some of the KMT candidates actually attempted to exploit this issue and to argue against same-sex marriage in their races. So those are some of the major issues in the campaign, and my colleagues will drill down into some of these in their presentations. What I want to focus on here is the switch in who was leading in this race, starting in about May 2019. Han Guoyu looked like he was leading 10, 15, even 20% in some polls. And then he suffers this inexorable downward descent over about 6 months, to the point where by the time the last polls were released before Election Day, it was clear to anybody who believed the polls that Tsai Ing-wen was likely to win this election going away. It wasn't going to be close. And in fact, that's what we got. So presidential results in 2016, Tsai Ing-wen wins about 56% of the vote. In 2020, she actually increased her vote share over that already large victory in 2016. Han Guoyu managed to consolidate most of the pan-blue vote behind him, but he didn't win anybody else. And so this was a case of Han really appealing to deep blue voters and Tsai Ing-wen carrying everybody else. And so we got another blowout in the presidential election. The legislative elections were also up for grabs. The DPP in 2016 won big. They won 68 seats, or about 60% of the total. In 2020, though, it looked like the DPP would be fighting an uphill battle to maintain this majority. And as recently as even a month ago, a lot of people were projecting that they would lose this majority and have to govern and have to build some kind of cross-party coalition to control the legislature. The election for the legislature is complicated by the entry of a bunch of small parties. It's not just a DPP-KMT race everywhere. There were a couple small parties, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The main competitors here were the New Power Party, which first came in 2016. They're towards the pro-independence end of the spectrum, but they also are kind of like a socially progressive or leftist party on the cross-cutting left-right cleavage that we think about in Europe or the United States. They were running again. The Taiwan People's Party that Mayor Ke founded had no positions to speak of. He basically attempted to position the party as being neither green nor blue. He even chose a color that was kind of a merger of those two to indicate that they were, if you didn't like either the green or the blue, you could vote aquamarine. They avoided taking positions on just about anything. They're only positions where we like good governance and we will do the right thing. Right? So a fairly vacuous campaign platform. And then finally, the People First Party was also running a slate. Terry Guo, when he did not run for president, then started endorsing some of the People First Party candidates, running ads for them. So they sort of evolved into a proxy campaign for Terry Guo as well. So all three of these were challenging the DPP and the KMT in some of the district legislative races and in the PR race as well. 3 electoral tiers in Taiwan. The largest component of seats are elected via from single-member districts using plurality vote. The DPP won most of those the last time around. 34 of the seats are elected on a closed-list PR vote. The DPP won a majority of those as well. And then finally, there's 6 reserved seats for indigenous voters. And the DPP is summarizing this way. So by electoral tier, the DPP lost 3 single-member district seats. The KMT gained 2. Independents won 5 seats in this election, but 3 of those are likely to ally with the DPP. So the 61 seat, the 4-seat majority is actually an underestimate. There will be a couple more that will coalition with the DPP. One of the major upsets of the night was Chen Guowei, a small party candidate, who defeated a kind of notorious legislator whose father was a longtime kind of prominent gangster in Taiwan. So this was a major upset. Basically, somebody the age of a college student here running against, I don't know, Al Capone or something, right? And beating him in an election. Okay. The PR tier, the Democratic Progressive Party lost quite a bit of the vote share. Their PR vote share was down by more than 10 points. And they lost that primarily to the Taiwan People's Party of Mayor Ke. So Mayor Ke he was not on the legislative list, but he's really the kind of face of this party, and they will do what he orders them to in the legislature. And so he's got some influence there now. Everything else shook up about as it did in 2016. And you can get a sense here of the major parties, how they did. The Taiwan People's Party, again, did surprisingly well. This was at the upper end of the range of what was forecast. And the New Power Party actually improved over 2016 as well. The final tier is the indigenous tier. There are 6 seats there. In a bit of a surprise, the DPP picked up another seat there. These seats traditionally have been very blue. They've almost all gone to the KMT. The DPP, though, now has 2 of 6. They won 1 in the lowland and 1 in the highland constituency. So the takeaways here, the DPP lost seats in this election, but they held on to their majority. They will get to choose the next speaker of the legislature. They will have a single party majority to work with the president. So I would expect politics in the legislature to look similar to politics over the last 4 years. The KMT ran better in the legislature than in the presidential race, but they only picked up a net of 3 seats altogether. So Han Guoyu was not a great candidate to carry other KMT candidates into office. He was really a drag on the party ticket rather than a benefit. The TPP broke through and is now the 3rd largest party, and Mayor Ke is quite well positioned to make an independent or a TPP party run for president in 2024. And I think my colleagues may talk about this more. I think he's likely to try that. So we may see a 3-party race in 2024 that's much more interesting than the one we just had. Finally, the New Power Party, which was the kind of, grew out of the Sunflower Movement in 2014, was a very youth-oriented party. It had a almost fatal split in the run-up to this election. A couple of its prominent legislators left the party. It wasn't clear it was even going to survive past this election. And in fact, it did. It did better than it did in 2016 on the party list. And it's got enough legislators to form a caucus now, so it will have continued influence in the legislature. Finally, the PFP is shut out of the legislature, and given that James Sohm is in his late 70s, well, I don't know, given who's running for president these days, maybe the late 70s is not disqualifying anymore. But this is probably his last presidential run. The PFP, if James Sohm was not around, is probably dead. And I would just note one thing that may not be immediately obvious. Terry Guo endorsed a bunch of PFP candidates and their tickets, and so Terry Guo, there's a lot of speculation that he might be a major political force going forward. I don't interpret this election as suggesting he has a whole lot of popular appeal. He wasn't able even to push the PFP over 5%. So I would discount the possibility that he might well run, but I don't think he'd be particularly successful in 2024. All right. So that's the lay of the land, and then I'll turn it over to Dennis for a drill down into some of these issues.
Well, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity. My name is Dennis Wang. I'm from Texas, of course, originally from Taiwan, as you can see. This is my great honor to be here to present some of my 2 cents about these elections. As Karis has mentioned, some background story about these elections. My topic today, my focus today will be about voting behavior, the dynamic of Taiwan's 2020 elections, party politics, and the future. So this is some of the questions I'd like to discuss today. Basically, I started with the story from 2016 to 2020, and then I'm going to talk about the key factors. What are the key factors? Although you probably already know the China things, but still, what are the key factors that determine the 2020 election outcome? And what are the impact? I try to explain this from 3 different perspectives. I'm going to talk about the party politics, the impact of party politics or competition. I'm going to talk about the Taiwan's future, and also I'm going to briefly talk about what's wrong with the poll. Han Guoyu told us so. It's actually quite challenging to a lot of a pollster and survey researcher. I'm going to briefly mention that. And the future competition, I'd like to make a little bit prediction about future, especially particularly 2024. So the background story, if you already know, President Tsai got elected back in 2016. She didn't do well in terms of the popularity. She got a lot of criticism because of the reform. She tried to do a lot of great things for Taiwan, but however, it is difficult to take all the reform at once. So, as Karis and most of you probably know, the census marriage, the labor standard law reform, and also the pension reform really hurt her popularity. In the first 2 years. And also, he tried to find an alternative to compensate the cross-strait relations, the declining cross-strait relations by proposing this southbound policy. The idea of southbound policy is to increase the trade relations with Southeast Asian countries. However, the effect and benefit of this southbound policy is hard. It's hard to see in a very short period of time. It takes time, basically. So, as we know, the first 2 years in President Tsai's terms, she experienced some downside. She experienced a lot of criticism. Even deep during camp in 2018, before 2018, a lot of people argued, well, she probably will need to be replaced by other members. Some senior pro-Taiwan independent group even support the former premier William Lai to challenge her in the party primary. But as we know now, Karis also mentioned, President Tsai managed to handle this and also defeated the challenger within her party and also unified the DPP after the primary. There are 2 guns, well, I use the terms, 2 guns for President Tsai to pick up. 2 events happened in before the elections. Especially the first one is Xi Jinping's political statement that made a lot of difference in terms of the popularity. So the Xi Jinping's political statement of the unification of China on January 2nd, 2019 was translated by President Tsai and the DPP government to one that the 1992 consensus is not as KMT argued. It's actually one China, 2 system. And the second major event happens is, of course, the Hong Kong protest, an anti-extradition law amendment bill movement. So today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan. These are the pictures you can see from the social media since the Hong Kong protest. A lot of young generation especially spread the word that today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan on social media, PTT, Facebook, Line, Instagram. That makes a lot of difference. The Taiwan equals Hong Kong, that's a question mark. Losing statehood is too strong to compete. Losing statehood, let me repeat this. Losing statehood is too strong to compete. The Mang Guo Gan, Wang Guo Gan. It's too strong. DPP successfully turned this to today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan, to the sense of losing statehood. And it's too strong to compete because, well, as Taiwan citizens, you like to defend Taiwan, you like to protect the country. So there's nothing else more important than that. Why? Well, look at this. Well, I used some data from National Chengchi University. In this presentation, you will see a lot of figures and tables. Well, trust toward China, the people's attitude, the Taiwanese people's attitude toward Chinese government. As you can see, in 2012, 2016, this blue bar, 2016 to 2019, distrust Chinese government. Before the Hong Kong protests, Taiwanese people distrust Chinese government even before the Hong Kong protests. But the level of distrust of Chinese government boosts to over 70%. That's very obvious after the Hong Kong protest. More and more Taiwanese people reconsider whether we should have pursue a peaceful communication with China. The neutral attitude declined and also the trust declined back lower than 5%. So what is really the factor, the determining factor for Taiwanese people to vote for President Tsai in these elections? Well, if you look back to the voting behavior or voting theory, a lot of people would argue economic voting is the key. So economic performance or government performance is the driving factor. If the government performs well, then people will reward the government and vote for the government. If the government performs poorly, then people will punish them. That's the basic idea. However, economic voting is not for Taiwan, especially in this time. Why? As I said, the sense of losing statehood is the key issue. It's the most important issue. Promoting Taiwan's democracy versus defending Taiwan's democracy is a very easy question. It's very easy to answer. Which one is more important? Defending Taiwan's democracy. Defending Taiwan is more important than making a big fortune. That's a KMT candidate, Han Kuo-yu's argument. KMT's candidate, Han Kuo-yu, keeps saying we have to make big fortune, help people make big fortune, whereas EPP saying we have to protect Taiwan's democracy. So I guess the Han Kuo-yu probably, or KMT learned this lesson from these elections. It's not only about economy, it's not only about making money. Protecting your country or protecting democracy is more important than making money. And that's Taiwanese people try to protect our own country. Leader image matters. I'd like to give you some idea about why leader image matters. Politicians can be unpopular, but it cannot be disliked. So performance. Look into the performance evaluation. From 2016 to 2019, the performance on economic development, President Tsai's performance, most people, even though the objective number looks really good, Taiwan's economic development is okay in terms of the GDP GDP growth and all the other objective numbers I said. But how people feel about this objective number is different. Economic evaluation is very, very subjective. Whether you feel like you have a better life, whether you feel like you earn more, it's very directive, it's very subjective. In 2016, from 2016 to 2018 and 19, before the Hong Kong protests, apparently very satisfied or below 5%. Somewhat satisfied with about 20%. Most people, most Taiwanese voters, evaluate President Tsai's performance not very well, not very well. However, as I said, if we follow the economic voting theory, then President Tsai probably will not get elected. But economic development is not a key issue. That's very simple. As you can see, the evaluation on performance also correlated with the Hong Kong protest. You notice that? How you evaluate President Tsai's performance is highly correlated after Hong Kong protests. Everything goes up. It has nothing to do with the objective number. It's subjective. You feel like, well, we have to do this. We feel better. President Tsai's performance on cross-strait relations, same thing. Very satisfied before 2019 Hong Kong protests. It's all decline. Very satisfied decline. And not very satisfied goes up. But right after the Hong Kong protest, things change. How you feel about President Tsai, totally different after the Hong Kong protest. So as I said, the overall performance, again, the evaluation on President Tsai's overall performance changed after the 2019 Hong Kong protest. And party support, same thing. Party support changed from 2016, when President Tsai got elected. Back to 2016, her DPP's party support popularity was 36%, and then, because the government performance, evaluation of government performance declined. So as you can see, the party support declined, and the support for KMT actually go up. If you look into this different time during the presidential election year, I collect all the presidential polls from all different sources, polling company, polling institution. This is what we have here. If you look at the trend, 2018, after the 2018 the local elections, the KMT really looks good. The possibility of KMT got elected as a president is really, really high. And then Hong Kong protests in June changed a lot of things. And also Hans nominated in July, again, make KMT, the support actually declined. Hans' first campaign rally kind of boosted the popularity, and then the party list nominated. The KMT announced their party list candidate. That hurt KMT's reputation and popularity. If you're familiar with Taiwanese politics, you probably heard about the pro-China candidate got nominated on the party list. It's like terrible. It's really hurting KMT's popularity. And as I said, the presidential candidate's image matters. Why? Feelings the thermometer toward the politician, the presidential candidate. Again, the National Chinchilla University conducted a survey before the election, after Hong Kong in protest. This is what happens. How people view Han. You may see a lot of supporters, die-hard supporters for Han Kuo-yu, but the thing is, he got a lot of people dislike him. So that's what I said. President Tsai, you probably don't feel very excited about President Tsai, but you don't dislike her. Okay, that's the key. You have to, as a presidential candidate, as a patriotic candidate or the leader, you can let everyone love you, but you can't have a lot of people hate you. That's the thing. So it's very obvious Han got no chance. Well, even though he got a lot of the crowd support him, but unfortunately, he's really, really, unlikable for like almost 60%. Okay, Taiwanese voter. I put Ko-en-je here, so because I also predict Ko-en-je has some change in the future. Right here, look at Ko-en-je. If you look at Ko-en-je, not many people hate him, and he got very similar pattern as President Tsai, and consider he will be running for 2024, so he got a chance. So the impact, as I said, the impact on party politics or competition. Well, I look into this from a different perspective, from different party perspective. For KMT is really need to reconsider how they view China. The 92 consensus is something they have to reconsider. One thing I like to address is Taiwan needs KMT. I shouldn't say Taiwan needs KMT. I should say Taiwan needs a strong, healthy opposition party. If KMT like to play the strong, healthy opposition party, they have to reconsider their policy toward China. So it's a crossroad for party policy. It can be likely to consensus. It can be again old man's party. It is a litmus test for small party vulnerability and strength. Can they survive without a clear position on China cross-strait relations? Like Karis mentioned, can TPP, the Taiwan People Party, really say, we don't have a strong stance on this, and we will figure out later. Can they do this? And it is a contest for future presidential hopeful for DPP. We've already seen some potential candidate. So no more 92 consensus. This elections, the electoral outcome simply send a very strong image or signal to China. There's no 92 consensus, no more 92 consensus. We have to, well, if anyone like to promote 92 consensus, this is the Taiwanese people's attitude toward unification or independence. As you can see, after the Hong Kong protest, more people look for Taiwan independence in the future. Immediate independence go up to 19%, it's almost 20%. We never had this number. And a lot of people say maintain status quo, but they will consider maintain status quo at this moment and then seek for independence later. So the attitude changed after the Hong Kong protest. So, and the party seat, Paris just mentioned, that some small party got a lot of seats. I also like to share with you this, the vote share. This is the real vote share, and if we analyze, look into the vote share, you see President Tsai got over 8 million votes. Over 8 million votes. That's a record high. But the 8 million votes, if you compare President Tsai's vote share and the party list vote share, there's a huge difference. 3.36 billion votes. Who are those voters who vote for President Tsai but didn't really want to vote for DPP? Who are those people? There are those people who consider themselves an independent voter or median voter. Those are the people Ko-Wen-je will consider to pursue. So that's why, if the third party really like to succeed or survive, they have to look into this number. And the DPP and KMT, really the difference is in terms of the party vote, they only have like 90,000 vote difference between these two major parties. So the future challenge, from a different angle, is actually somewhat equivalent as a Taiwan independent referendum. Say no to unification is a very strong signal. It's how you interpret it is maybe different, but it's a very strong signal that Taiwanese people like our way of living, like democracy, like the democratic way of living. So that's a strong signal. And it's also a strong signal we're willing to collaborate more closely with the United States. And the chance for improving cross-strait relation at the government level is very limited. I'm going to explain later. Well, born independence, the 10th new generation changed mind. That's another question for us to consider, whether the generational gap exists or the life cycle things will happen. Whether the born independence generation, when they turn to 30 or 40 or 50, they change mind. If they have to work with Chinese company, if they have to make a living, if they change, or are they going to change mind? That's something we have to observe in the next couple of years. So Taiwan's future. Perhaps Beijing's authority will not use harsh economic measure to deal with Taiwan, but there's a possibility, even before the elections, to talk about the unilateral termination of this early harvest list under ACFA signed in 2010. That's a challenge we have to consider. That's a challenge for the entire Taiwan to think about. And what can be almost certain is that Taiwan's international space, it is a possibility that China will do something to squeeze the international space for Taiwan. But as I said, probably the closer U.S.-Taiwan tie could help. We'll see. The impact. President Tsai made a huge announcement, a big announcement, a friendly announcement about a U.S.-Taiwan-China relation. She's willing to talk to anyone. She's willing to talk to PRC, but there's some kind of restraint or limitation. After victory, how President Tsai deal with the pressure internally within the DPP. Tsai's policy toward mainland China has kind of limited room because, he got elected by a lot of people who wanted to fight against China. DPP's new Thai faction, they typically take a very tough stance on cross-strait relations. So how are we going to deal with this? Because most of them will remain in office, and they probably will be in very influential positions. And although President Tsai said 4 conditions, if you look at the 4 conditions, peace, equality, dialogue, and democracy, the first 3, I think it's no problem, but the final word, final term, democracy. The term democracy simply warned Beijing authorities should have a hands-off way of dealing with Taiwan and its status. And that's something, we don't know if PRC will take it easily. So from China's perspective, we can imagine, well, President Xi cannot afford to let Taiwan go. So President Xi's failure to manage Taiwan will actually hurt his reputation, and he cannot face the general public in China. That's a challenge for President Xi. So that's why I mentioned this is a challenge for Taiwan, because it seems to me it's a very limited room for China and Taiwan to have a peaceful communication. Although Taiwan is always trying to, talk to them friendly. We like to talk to them for sure, but it's up to President Xi, whether he like to save his face. So the polls are reliable until Han Kuo-yu says so. If you look at this, well, a lot of people says the polls are inaccurate if you are Han supporters, or you may believe the polls are not, it's not reliable. There's a reason for Hans to argue that. Because back to the end of November, there are 3 consecutive days of 3 different polling institutions review the data over 30% margin, reported by Liberty Times, April Daily, Green Party Green Party survey. After those 3 consecutive surveys, Han Kuo-yu started mentioning, well, those are inaccurate poll, which is a terrible strategy. Well, I will interpret it that way. It's a terrible strategy because it's also make a lot of people don't know what to follow. And after that, presidential candidate Han Kuo-yu asked supporters to lie to the pollster, so you can see the poll actually goes really, really bad. Future competition is ready to launch. If you follow Taiwanese politics within BPP, you may notice William Lai, the BP, and also Zheng Wen-Can is looking forward to have an opportunity. Zheng Wen-Can is a Taoyuan city mayor. It's very likely to run for, it's very possible, a high possibility he will be, he is a rising star already. For TPP, Koenig is definitely running for president in 2024. For KMT, I just put the name, it doesn't really matter. Just to be fair, introduce the Derek Cho is like old-fashioned politician. Jiang Yijiang, if you really like to look for the KMT, find some decent politician. Those are the 2 names you probably you may pay attention to. Jiang Yijiang, Jiang Qichen in Taizhou, he's a political science professor before. Jiang Qichen in Taizhou, and also Hou Youyi in New Taipei City. Those are the name you probably keep in mind. Others is also fair because the Jen Song, if the health condition help, well, I believe in him. He will be running. Why not? And Terry Guo, I think Terry Guo will definitely try. Well, Terry Guo has nothing but money, so why not? So that's the thing. Also, for future competition, believe it or not, the future competition is already launched, has already started. So moving forward to a normal democracy, Taiwan needs a consensus. Joke aside, I think Taiwan has shown the world that we have a very strong, powerful democracy. We try to tell people in the whole world that we protect our democracy, we care about our democracy, we care about our life of living. And these 2 camps, well, some people support DPP, some people support, the KMT or the Republic of China. It doesn't matter, we all Taiwan. Zheng Wen-Can, I got a chance to talk to Zheng Wen-Can. Zheng Wen-Can mentioned, I like the idea. In Taiwan, we have Taiwan blue, Taiwan green, but we all Taiwan team. So that's the key things. Moving forward, if we'd like to become a normal democracy and get a lot of support from the whole world, we need to show people that we are united Taiwan. So that's a brief presentation about this election. Some key issues, as I mentioned, mainly this time is we try to save the democracy, we try to save Taiwan, but hopefully, hopefully in the future election, the Taiwanese people get a chance to talk about real issue, real policy. A normal democracy should be able to discuss the real public policy. Not only focus on cross-strait relations or defending democracy. Yeah, that's something we all need to consider. Okay, thank you for your listening. Thank you for your time.
Hi, good evening. I have quite literally had a very long day. I got an extra 16 hours. I flew out of Taipei at 11:30 this morning. With the time change, I'm still going. And as Karis will attest, we did not have very reasonable bedtimes while we were in Taipei, and I blame that on Brian Hyo and other people. But it was a great trip, and I'm delighted that I could come straight here from that. I'm going to go no tech. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not quantitative. I'm a lawyer. That means I play fast and loose with methodology, but I have really strong opinions, and it seems to work. So let me fill in a few areas that are a little bit different, that were touched on in the first two presentations, but hopefully add some texture and color to that. The big first block I want to talk about are some of these social issues and human rights issues that are percolating in the debate. And then secondly, I do want to talk a little more about the cross-strait relations aspect and how that played in to the election and also what we might see going forward. So with respect to the social issues, same-sex marriage has been really fascinating to follow. And we focus so much right now on the executive branch because the presidential election and the legislative branch because of the legislative UN election. But there's a third very important branch, and actually two more on top of that in Taiwan. But of course the judiciary, and that is not something that is elected in Taiwan. I think that's a very good thing. But the Constitutional Court has played a very important role in the post-martial law era. The Republic of China Constitution has been there all along. It just wasn't doing much, if any, work to protect individual rights for all those decades of martial law. And for those of you who are not conversant in Taiwan's history, martial law lasted until 1987, right? And then on the outer islands even later. And so I think as an American, there was this idea of free China, and that just meant not communist China. But of course, under Chiang Kai-shek, it was a military dictatorship. And so we had the Constitutional Court gradually in the 1990s and then the aughts take on a more role in the forefront of protecting individual liberties. Now in 2017, the court issued an opinion, it's an interpretation, saying that the government had to allow same-sex marriage. Now, unlike in the United States, where when something is found unconstitutional, it's bam, it's unconstitutional from the moment that opinion comes out. In Taiwan, there's this mechanism where the court can say, okay, rest of the government, we're going to give you a runway to figure out how you want to implement this. So in May of 2017, the court said, you must allow same-sex marriage. You have 2 years to figure out how you want to make that happen. Otherwise, the default is same-sex couples can just go and register without a law. So you had 2 years of this really interesting debate about, okay, so should the fundamental law of the civil code be amended to just make it gender neutral and say two people, whoever you are, can get married? Should there be a separate law? Should there be nothing at all? And this brought out some really strong feelings about family values, what is a family, which from an American perspective felt very familiar because we've gone through similar debates in our country. And then literally in the last week before that 2 years ran out, the bill went through the legislature and was passed. And actually for that we owe a lot of gratitude to Premier Su Chang, who has become a really fiery and exciting personality in the Tsai administration. And what was interesting about that law that was passed is it's not called a same-sex marriage law or a marriage equality law. Rather, it's the law implementing the Constitutional Court's interpretation. So in that way, it was kind of like the Tsai administration saying, we want to get this law through, but we're trying to do it in the most delicate, not overt manner as possible. So what happened now is same-sex marriage is legal, but there's still a lot of questions that are out there. One question is that adoption is allowed within the couples if one of the people in that couple is the biological parent. The other parent can adopt the child. But the question is open. What about adopting children from outside that couple? Also open is the question about what if one of the two people in the couples comes from a country that does not recognize same-sex marriage. Big issues that are connected to family building, ideas about how should assisted reproductive technology be used. Because right now surrogacy is illegal in Taiwan. That obviously makes it very difficult for a same-sex male couple to have a biological child. Also, single women cannot use assisted reproductive technology. Now, from a demographic perspective, we were talking about how Tsai got 8.1 million votes. There's about 19 million registered voters, okay, and a few numbers. And the total population is 23.5 million. Now, the voting age is 20. Do the math. 19 million registered voters, 23.5 million total population, and the voting age is 20. No one is having babies in Taiwan, and this is a major issue because the demographic pyramid has been totally flipped around. So there's more old people than young people. This is also important when it comes to voting because older people tend to be more socially conservative. And so you have a large voting bloc that is from a much older, so we hear a lot about the youth vote, I think because they're on social media, we see them, but in fact, the older voters are extremely important. So one question is, if you're really serious about trying to increase the birth rate, will there be more encouraging, allowing single women, allowing same-sex couples to build families? And these issues might be going through the Constitutional Court as well. A second sort of human rights or social issue is about refugees. About 12 years ago, in the Ma Ying-jeou administration, Taiwan took the two major fundamental human rights treaties in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR, and that's really hard, and brought them into domestic law. Now, Taiwan cannot actually become a party to these treaties because of its unusual status in international law. It doesn't have a seat in the UN, it isn't recognized in that UN body, so it can't actually take its paper saying we have ratified these treaties domestically and deposit it in Geneva. But what the Ma administration did is said, we'll just take the whole darn treaties and stuff them into domestic law, and then every 5 years or so, we'll have a review mechanism domestically that mirrors what the review mechanism would be in Geneva if we were a state party. So it's creating this sort of parallel process. That's great. Taiwan has done this with other international treaties too. Taiwan has not taken the International Convention on Refugees and brought it into domestic law. And in fact, there is no other sort of clear refugee law. What if someone shows up and says, I'm seeking political asylum because I'm coming from a country where I'm being persecuted for my religion, for my political views, for some basis that would normally be recognized as a reason that that person would have to be protected under international law. This issue's kind of been out there, but the Hong Kong protest put it to the forefront. Because suddenly, it's easy to fly between Hong Kong and Taiwan. My kids love it. We're in Taiwan, we go to Hong Kong Disneyland in like 2 hours, right? So, but these Hong Kong protesters were coming over and saying, I don't want to go back. And not only do I not want to go back, but I'm afraid of going back because of my political views could land me in jail. And so suddenly, this issue that had been simmering came to the forefront. The Tsai administration has said existing law is able to deal with people who want to stay, and there is a law that deals with relations with Hong Kong that could be massaged to cover this. However, that's a little bit of a cop-out because it's not really directly confronting this issue, and it's also not saying what if someone comes from another repressive regime somewhere in the world? What happens then? So I think in this second term, it'll be interesting to see if Tsai leans into this a little bit more and takes a little bit more assertive stance, and in fact even does something symbolic, even if not legally binding, to try to take that international refugee law and make it more explicit or a little bit more in the forefront in Taiwan. And this is really interesting because even in the last 24 hours, 36 hours or so, Kenneth Roth, who is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, was going to Hong Kong to release Human Rights Watch's International Global Human Rights in the World report. And thinking that that was a perfect place to release their report because it highlighted one of the major concerns about current human rights situations. Kenneth Roth's been going to, he's been going to Hong Kong for ages. Shows up at immigration, they say, turn around, get back on the plane. No explanation given. This was shocking, okay? So he gets back on the plane, no explanation given. Since he was sent back, China Daily, Global Times, it's come out that Beijing has owned this. You know, we don't want Human Rights Watch coming to Hong Kong. That's interesting both because suddenly Human Rights Watch is not welcome in Hong Kong. That's really an important development, and that Beijing has flat out said, and it was our decision, not even trying to really cover this by saying the Hong Kong leadership, Carrie Lam, made this decision, we haven't talked that much about it. So I think that the fact that now we're seeing that level of restriction on civil and political rights in Hong Kong is going to make the Tsai government have even more pressure to come out with a position on this. And the third issue, which I expect no movement on, is the death penalty. Taiwan still has the death penalty. There are, Vicky can correct me, 39 people on death row, give or take, so yeah. And so not a lot, but you know, it still is an issue. And in fact, during Tsai's first 4 years, there was an execution. Didn't have to be, it has to be approved by the executive branch to actually carry out the execution. And Tsai herself has been very quiet on the death penalty because public support is huge for the death penalty. So this is an issue. If there's going to be movement, it really needs to be leadership from the front. It needs to be leadership from the executive branch and then from the legislative branch. I don't expect it to go away. I do think we can hope perhaps for more demanding, exacting procedures for the review process before the death penalty is carried out. And this is in part because of the great work of civil society organizations like the Taiwan Yuanyu Pingfang Xiehui or the Taiwan Innocence Project. And they've done really important work to exonerate people who were wrongly convicted. I mean, these were people who, based on DNA evidence, have been found to not have been the perpetrators of the crimes for which they were convicted. And I think that those are the kind of activities that might slowly change public opinion, because once the public loses faith that the death penalty is actually being used against people who committed the crimes for which they are being killed, that tends to be a first step in really bringing into question whether it's something that the government should be continuing. So yeah, so you know, those are just a few. There's going to be other, I think, sort of human rights, social issues coming out. Again, all of these could involve the Constitutional Court, and I'm curious to see what role the court plays. From conversations with some of the justices, my sense is that although they tend to take a conservative role in the sense of not wanting to be too out there in the forefront, but yet there is some stomach for being a little bit more of an activist court, so perhaps they're going to be a little bit more forward in trying to attack some of these issues. And I also think these issues are interesting because when we think about how Taiwan is perceived outside of Taiwan and this idea of soft power, and one of the things that drives people who study Taiwan crazy are the tropes, like everything is in a move that will raise Beijing's ire, you know, and you know, everything being put in this context of cross-strait relations. And the same-sex marriage bill was the first time in a long time I saw international media covering Taiwan about Taiwan and not in the context of what does this mean for cross-strait relations. So I think a lot of these issues and this emphasis on having a, again, vibrant democracy overused, but a thriving, stable democracy that has had multiple free and fair democratic elections really builds Taiwan's soft power internationally. And when you see this even more as under Xi Jinping with what's happening in Xinjiang and the repression of the Uyghurs, the contrast across the strait is getting starker by the day. Now, this is one thing that's happening now that is questioning whether there might be some tension with this commitment to democracy and freedoms is the Anti-Infiltration Act. And to be clear, China is trying to infiltrate Taiwan. It's being naive, Pollyanna-ish to say there's not a there there. The question is, how should the Taiwan government respond to the efforts, whether it be straight up sort of cyber warfare or the more subtle disinformation campaigns and this spreading of rumors and just flat out false information. Well, a lot of this, not all of it, but a significant amount seems to be coming from China-tied sources. Now, this new law, it's really new, it's just passed at the end of December. My concern is that it does seem a little ambiguous in how it's worded, which is going to leave a lot of discretion in the hands of prosecutors. And as long as you trust those prosecutors, that's all well and good. But as someone who teaches US criminal procedure, I generally don't trust prosecutors as a group if they have too much power. So I think we're going to see a lot of discussion over the coming years about how to curb Chinese influence or try to at least bring more transparency to it, while at the same time maintaining freedoms. And the next thing to look for is perhaps a foreign agent registration law, which you see kind of Japan and Australia and the US to a certain extent. Now, a little bit more just on cross-strait relations, then I want to open it up for questions for all three of us. There's, of course, defense is a huge issue in Taiwan, and I think defense needs to be thought of in a more holistic way. So one is defense about information, and one thing that Karis and I did is we went to the Taiwan Fact Check Center, and it's only been there 2 years maybe, and it's doing is actually somehow they've been able to collaborate with Facebook, which is amazing, and like if there's fake news, they find whether it be false claims about politics or false claims about medical or food safety, that post will get kind of grayed out and it'll say this is, incorrect. I don't think they say Josh Xiaoqi, but it's like, it's incorrect. And here's our report explaining why. And you can click on it and it'll give why it's saying that this is misinformation. And in fact, sometimes make it so it pings back, and if someone has forwarded on that post, they will get that report sent to them. And once fake news is out there, it's hard to stop it. You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, but there's at least a hope that it won't spread like wildfire, that they might at least staunch the flow. So I think how to deal with disinformation is a big question going forward. Of course, traditional defense, buying F-16s, buying what will the US sell Taiwan, and that's been pretty robust under the Trump administration. The worry is that Taiwan has some pretty fancy looking military equipment, but what happens if China knocks out the energy grid? I mean, how do you have it so there's distributed power, for example, that if there is a disruption in the energy grid, that there is a complete lack of energy and of electricity. And I think that some of these sort of questions about what is the defense strategy is really important, and we'll see who is in charge of defense and those parts of the government. And the third thing that, more generally, to defend a place, people have to feel like it's worth fighting for. And one thing I always find interesting is, what does patriotism mean in Taiwan? Because, this is a Taiwan Studies, it's not a Republic of China Studies program. I don't think I've ever met someone who, when I say, oh, what country are you from? They go, Republic of China. Maybe someone who's really deep blue back there, but people say Taiwan. And so, with Tsai, she generally speaks in terms of Taiwan, But she was in the campaign kind of throwing in the, 中华民国 Taiwan. And so she would put in the ROC, but it's not as strong of an emphasis, of course, as the KMT on the historical Republic of China continuing to be a vital presence. It's more that that's part of who we are, but we're really Taiwan. And I found it very interesting, the discussions about switching to a volunteer military, because Taiwan has always relied on conscription, and the military service for just the men has gotten increasingly short. And from all I can tell, it's kind of a joke. It's not actually making a military force that could repel any invasion, and people try to get out of it as best they can. But to go to an all-volunteer force, which is not happening easily in Taiwan, you need to have a sense that this is something that people do and it's respected. And we kind of kept hearing the old school kind of like good people don't become soldiers. It's not seen as like Joe Biden out there talking about his son's service. And so if you're going to defend this place Taiwan, whatever you want to call it, you need to get people who are invested in protecting it militarily, keeping their money there, not just investing in real estate, but investing in entrepreneurial industry, paying their taxes. Tax revenues are actually quite low. How do you get it so it's a really viable place? And I think that's a real struggle for any administration. So finally, what is Xi Jinping going to do? I mean, I wish I could say I looked into his eyes and saw his soul and knew. I mean, all we know is that Xi is smart and he's ruthless, and so he has no problem with repression. And if there's a choice between loosening the screws and tightening the screws, everything he's done, at least since he's really consolidated power, is tighten the screws. And my concern is what Beijing has learned from Hong Kong is not, we should have loosened them and gotten rid of the extradition bill, but rather we should have tightened the screws sooner. We didn't step in fast enough. So I always worry that that's going to be where Beijing will go, is more tightening, not less tightening, given the current leadership. But the initial response from Beijing was just repeating the old party line on Taiwan, which is good. They had to say it, and they said it, but it was not exciting. And now going forward, I think the best we could hope for is just a détente, but I think what we're probably going to see is this more squeezing, pulling off more diplomatic allies, trying to have more of a brain drain, trying to find ways to squeeze Taiwan's international space, but I don't know what's left. I guess try to get them out of APEC, but I mean, at this point, like Taiwan has so little, they're not space. They're no longer going to the World Health Assembly, can't get into ICAO, can't get into Interpol, so there's not much left to squeeze. So I think, the more that Taiwan can kind of shore up its international support, hang on, because hanging on is pretty good right now, given what's the threat across in Beijing, and also try to get more people to know what Taiwan is. I was a Fulbright scholar 2 years ago. And I was really happy when I heard this year that applications to do Fulbrights in Taiwan are up significantly, because the way that Americans will really care about Taiwan is if not just the people in Taiwan think about it as their place, but if Americans and others outside of Taiwan think of Taiwan as a place and a distinct place that is worth preserving and supporting. So with that, I think let's open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. So we'll have everybody come up here to the front, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Eric has a microphone, so please speak into that if they do have a question. Robert.
Thanks very much for a really informative presentation. I learned a lot. So one of the things that I'm interested in is the rise of populism around the world. Could you talk a little bit more about the populism that's apparent failure, I guess is the way you're characterizing it in Taiwan, and tell us what you see as perhaps potential for increase in populism in the future if there is such a thing?
Yeah. That's a good idea. We could take a couple more questions and then answer them together. Over here, David.
Again, thank you. I to perhaps challenge Professor Wang with the idea that a normal political system, a real political system, is one where you're talking about public policy. It strikes me, if you're essentially dealing with existential questions about the existence of the state and the continued existence of the state, that's as real and as democratic and as normal as, or as vibrant and real as any democracy should be. And in fact, you know, we don't see public policy necessarily as being all that real in many respects. Politicians promise everything. So I guess I'm just objecting to a line of criticism that Taiwan's democracy is, young, it's not normal, it's, still immature. In fact, I think Taiwan is a much more mature democracy in many ways than the United States is today.
One more question, or should? One more question.
I'm always very frustrated with the name of Taiwan, either Republic of China, Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei. It's just so ridiculous. This may be a law question. Put aside the opposition from China, is there a way through Constitution they change the name?
Okay, we'll leave it to our experts.
Well, I can attempt to tackle a populism question at least. Is this on? Is this thing on? So Han Guoyu, I referred to him as a populist because I think he was using very populist language in his 2018 campaign and in his 2020 campaign. And specifically, he talked about the elites versus the people. I don't know that he coined this term, but he certainly brought it to political discourse in Taiwan. Shuyin, the common people. Shu is related to the term bastard in Chinese, and so it's like the bastards out there, us lowlifes. And so he would refer to the people as the common people, and then there are the elites up in Taipei or in the ruling party, the DPP, and they're just living, they're feasting off the rest of us. And that was a consistent theme both in 2018 and in 2020, and some of that language got very extreme. In 2018, that populist rhetoric fell on very dry tinder. It was the spark that really lit his campaign. And the reason there was dry tinder in Kaohsiung was, number one, the DPP had been running that city for 20 years. Number two, Kaohsiung economically looks broadly similar to the kinds of places where we see populists flourish in the rest of the Western world. So it's a kind of Rust Belt city. It used to be the most industrialized area of Taiwan. It was a big shipbuilding area. There's chemical plants all over the place. And a lot of that kind of legacy industry has shed workers like the Rust Belt in the United States. And Kaohsiung's own prosperity has stagnated while other parts of Taiwan have boomed and rushed ahead. So Kaohsiung is no longer the second largest city in Taiwan. Taichung is. Hsinchu is where all the high-tech centers are, not in Kaohsiung. And so there's a sense among the citizens of Kaohsiung that it's fallen behind. The DPP's developmental strategies there have not provided for the common person, and so Han's rhetoric really, I think, made some inroads in what most of us observing Taiwan would have guessed was a deep green place that would never vote again for the KMT. So he tried to replicate that in the national election, and I think that failed for a couple of reasons. One is, well, I'll make this point, but I'll also direct you to an op-ed that was in the New York Times yesterday by Nathan Bada of Academia Sinica, Identity Politics. So the China issue is fundamental in national elections, less so in local elections, where you're not choosing a president when you're voting for the mayor of Kaohsiung. You're kind of taking in the 2018 election, you were just taking a risk on something new. And if you don't like the status quo, sure, fine, we'll go with that. But in 2020, you're potentially choosing a president who could sign a peace treaty with China next year, right? You want somebody who's experienced, who's articulate, who's able to understand negotiation, and Han was none of those things. And so the kind of deep green identity leanings of Gao Song really reasserted themselves in the national election, trumped the populist rhetoric. In fact, if you look at the swing from 2016 in the presidential vote count to 2020, there is very little geographic variation in that swing, which suggests to me that the effort to mobilize a kind of populist, geographic-based shift in the vote failed miserably. Let's see, so that was the main thing. And then, will it reemerge? I wouldn't discount the possibility of there being a future populist who has some similar success in Taiwan. And the thing that I'll note is Taiwan is an aging society, as Maggie mentioned, and the voting patterns, the differences between rural and urban areas are growing starker. In particular, the vote for these new third parties on the party list, the vote for them was much higher in the municipalities than it was in the rural areas. And so there's quite a stark split in voting patterns, not on identity so much as on your party list vote, where you don't have to vote strategically, but you can vote sincerely. There's an opportunity if one or the other of the major parties kind of abandons that working class base, or doesn't sufficiently appeal to them, for a third party to kind of emerge that uses very populist rhetoric and actually make some inroads, especially in the rural areas. So, yeah, so it's something to keep an eye on. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
So I'm going to answer the questions from the audience. So the last slides I mentioned, moving toward a normal democracy, is a question regarding a normal democracy. Well, in Taiwan, since the very first presidential elections, well, not 1996 one, but 2001. So since 2000, previous research, tons of research study the driving factor for voters to vote for a certain candidate. It's always about China. It's always about Tongdu issue. That's why I argue, well, for a real democracy, normally in Western democracy, different elections we see different important issue, balance issue, the so-called the most important issue which drive the election outcome in different democracy at different time may differ, may vary. But in Taiwan, it's only one. It's always one, the Tongdu China. It's always Tongdu. That's why I argue, I just hope that in the future, Taiwanese people can actually discuss thoroughly about other important issue, not only focus on the Tongdu issue. Of course it is important, of course defending Taiwan's democracy is important, but to general public, there is something else also important, sex marriage, the human rights issues. Those issues are, missing in any elections, even though some of the young generation really give it a fight for those social issue, but no one actually cares. No one actually, vote for someone because of that reason. Mainly just driven by the Tongdu issue. I hope, well, I think, for a better democracy, for better Taiwan, we must have to discuss other issues as well, other than the only China factor. And I do believe this election has an impact, has some influence on this. Because this election may KMT to reconsider the China factor is not a card for them to play. It's no longer China card, no longer peaceful communication with China. It's all about Taiwan, and all the opposition party in Taiwan, all the political party in Taiwan should focus on something else other than just the cross-strait relation issue. It's important, but we have to have a unified opinion toward China and focus on something else. That's what I argue, the normal democracy. I'm not saying Taiwan is not a mature democracy. Well, we're all proud of Taiwan's democracy, and Taiwan is a mature democracy, but simply because China has made Taiwan, struggle with one issue. So that's my response to the normal question.
So first on Han, I second reading Nathan Batto's New York Times op-ed, and he also has a blog called Frozen Garlic, because frozen garlic sounds like Dong Swan, goes to vote, so yeah. But it's a great, so if you really want to geek out on Taiwanese politics, he's the best person, I think, to read his analysis, which comes out a lot. One thing, I mean, so the longer Han Kuo-yu campaign, the worse he did. I think all the graphs show that. And I don't know if that just means that Taiwanese voters are smarter than American voters, that they realize the guy really didn't have the goods to run the place. But when we were having meetings, and Carson and I were asking people who were saying with a strained face that they were supporting Han, well, why would he make a good president? And one of the first things that people would often say is, he's good at delegating. And don't get me wrong, if you're president, you're going to have to delegate a lot because there's too much to do. But I don't want the first thing to come out of someone's mouth about why someone makes a good president is they won't do much and someone else will do it. So I think people were getting it. And now the KMT is going to it's having an identity crisis. I don't think the KMT is going away. It's got a whole party structure. Someone's going to buy the brand, remake it in a new way, maybe without the 92 consensus. We'll see, but it's good. The intra-party dynamics in the KMT are going to get real. Like, there are factions that are coming out, and so we'll see how that shakes out over the coming years. One other dynamic in the campaign that was interesting and disappointing to follow was the misogyny. That of all the listing of the possible 2024 candidates, I didn't hear one woman. And when I asked the young KMTers, well, who are the up-and-coming women, they kind of pause, and there are some, but they're really young. Like and they're like, we'll go find one to talk to you. That's great. So I do think, though, that Tsai and Wen, there were a number of times that other candidates and people in politics would make comments about her not understanding women's issues because she's childless or she doesn't understand kids, and she's this crazy cat woman. And so and I really respect Tsai that she owned it. So she's like, well, I'm going to have cool kind of anime cartoons with me as kind of a superhero. They're going to call me Spicy, then I'll have my latte pie. Like, you're going to use this. I'm going to own this. And so she's president not because she's a woman, but in spite of being a woman. And I do think that those attacks on her also reflect bigger issues about how women are still treated in Taiwanese society. One reason the birth rate is low is it's very hard to fulfill the expectations of traditional motherhood and have a career. I get off easy because I'm foreign, so they just don't think I know how to raise my kids, and I don't put enough clothes on them, and I let them eat too many strawberries, which is going to throw off their chi. But I do think this sort of, how does it become parenting to be something that's shared with the men and women equally is an important issue. About the name of Taiwan, if Tsai, or if Taiwan was to say, we're going to declare we are the Republic of Taiwan, Xi Jinping would respond, and not with tightening the screws, but with a hammer. That is a red line, that is a hongxian, and it would be stupid to do that. So, I mean, what you're gonna, I think, see is Tsai Ing-wen is very savvy, and I was saying, she's steady. So if I was in like one of those Mission Impossible movies where there's a bomb, and if you cut the red wire, it goes off, if you cut the green, it won't, you need a steady hand, I might pick Tsai Ing-wen, because she is really steady. Like, she's got a terrible job. She's got Trump and Xi Jinping, and she's trying to manage this relationship, right? And she's doing a pretty darn good job of it. So I think she's going to continue to try to find a way to have increasing soft independence, to have that Taiwan identity at the forefront, but without going so far as to cut anchor with that historical ROC that makes it so, no, it's still ROC Constitution, no, it's still the same flag, still the same national seal, and that makes it so she hasn't provoked Beijing. And I know it must be, I'm not Taiwanese, although there are some Taiwan ROC passport holders who are now, white. But I know, so I get why my Taiwanese friends are so frustrated, especially those from Benshengren families, from the families that have been in Taiwan for hundreds of years, when they see their national flag, it's got the freaking KMT symbol on it, right? That hurts. But at the same time, is there a way to own that in a new way, such that there's pride in that flag, even if it has a fraught history behind it? And that is a challenge for the Tsai government, to find that pride while still having to hang on to some of the existing symbols because of the political realities.
All right, we can take another group of questions. One 2, and we'll have Director Fan as number 3.
This is a question for Karen. I know you've written about indigenous electoral representation in Taiwan. I know it's only 2 representatives, but it seems significant that they're not 100% KMT now. Can you talk about what that is, what that represents? Should I be reading more into that? There's something, even though it's 2, there's something cool and interesting about that, I think.
Actually, related question, mostly for Dennis. My question is about demographic breakdown of voting patterns. It doesn't seem like there's that much data out there yet, but I'd love to just hear if you have any observations about demographic patterns. Just anecdotally, it seems like the narrative is that the youth vote is overwhelmingly DPP or pan-green, and observationally, I think the Aboriginal Indigenous vote, I think as we've seen, has ticked a little bit toward the DPP, and it seems like the Hakka vote has held fairly blue, at least the districts. So is there anything we know about, religion, socioeconomic status, income, geography, age, ethno-linguistic group, and so on? Just what are the observations? Are there any interpretations of the data so far?
Hi. Well, I think 3 of you all mentioned a lot about this election of Taiwan, and only Dennis mentioned that the ties with the U.S. Taiwan should be enhanced or closer ties. But I think during the process, either the questions or your answers, we can see that the reason Taiwan is so close to the United States, actually we share the same values: human rights, democracy, rule of law, that kind of things, core values in the Western world. So that's why we can have very good, closer relations. But under this kind of similarity, we always call that like-minded countries. United States is the leading country during that group. Others like Canada, UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, France, maybe. But how can we, after this election, how can we keep on increase the ties between Taiwan and the US? Maybe, I think trade is the most important one, aside from the value, right? Maybe FTA or BTA, bilateral trade agreement, that kind of thing. What's your perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I actually have thoughts on all 3 of these, so I'll weigh in on all 3. I'll turn it over to my colleagues. So the significance of the DPP capturing not 1 but 2 indigenous seats. Let me clarify for the audience that there are actually 2 constituencies from which indigenous representatives are elected. They're elected using the old single non-transferable vote system that Taiwan used to use for all their districts. So there's 3 in each, and the top 3 vote getters all get in, but voters can only vote for 1 of however many are on the ballot. So what that means is you can get in with much less than 50% of the vote. And there's been an increase in support for the DPP to the point where they're now winning maybe 15 or 20% of the vote in both of those districts, and that's enough to get one representative elected. The highland and the lowland are actually politically a bit different as well. So the highland is more, well, they're traditionally much more isolated they're much more conservative or traditional communities. Lowland are much more integrated with other Taiwanese. They tend to be in, if not in cities, at least in more cosmopolitan areas. And so the DPP breaking into the highland is actually a major difference from past elections. And I'm eager to dig into the numbers. I haven't had a chance to do this yet, to go down to drill down at least to the township level and see where this new Indigenous representative got her votes from. She came out of the blue. I'd never heard her name before election night. I hadn't actually paid attention to that race at all, and then poof, there's an extra DPP seat there, and I'm like, who the heck is that? Where did that come from? And it turns out she's an Indigenous activist, and they have traditionally not fared well in these elections either. It's traditionally been township or village leaders who have strong connections in their tribes or in their factional networks that they've built up, and they have been elected on the KMT ticket or as independents. So Indigenous activists generally have done terribly in these local races because they have no local roots. And so it's possible that something fundamental is changing here, that younger Indigenous voters are voting based on other lines besides who their chief and their village endorses. But it's also possible that she has some kind of connections that other DPP candidates did not. I would note the other DPP candidate who has been reelected got in initially because her father was county executive of Hualien, I believe, in the 90s. And he used, KMT county executive, in fact, he used his network to get her into office. So she looks much more like a traditional KMT representative. She's just got a different party label attached to her. This new one looks more promising to me in the sense that it suggests that we might be in a new era. On the demographic breakdown, age is the big difference across. So there was some pre-election polls that you could actually, if you pooled them together, then you could actually do some subsets of the data. And under 50 are very strongly green, or very strongly at least Tsai supporters. And in fact, the 20 to 29 age group was voting for Tsai, something like 4-1 over Han. Yeah, it's huge. 30 to 39 was maybe 3-1. 40 to 49, maybe 2 or 5-1. And then in the 60 to 80 category, it's a bit more balanced. But age is a huge difference between the parties in terms of their supporters. And so what that suggests for the KMT is that their core base is going to age out of the electorate very soon, or at least over the next generation, right? Unless they change strategy and they're able to renew their appeal to younger voters. We also know from political science that Taiwan's a pretty institutionalized party system. It has high partisanship. Partisanship is formed when you're young and when you first start voting. And so the people voting now for Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP are establishing that initial partisanship. And the longer they continue to do that, the harder it is to get them to switch. And so this system kind of gets locked in. And if I'm a KMT party member trying to forecast where the party's going to be in 20 years, this is a really dire picture. And so they desperately need to promote some younger candidates who can basically speak the language of young people and use a different rhetoric on Taiwan identity and cross-strait relations as well. The last question on how might the U.S. and Taiwan increase our ties? Certainly a free trade agreement or bilateral agreement, investment agreement, and the one that I always hammer that doesn't get any attention outside of our little circles is a tax treaty. James, where are you? Yes, so every time we have a speaker from Taiwan come to our program and we pay them an honorarium, the federal government takes 32% of that honorarium, and so we have to top it up. If we had a tax treaty in Taiwan, we could just pay them the $500 or $1,000 for the honorarium, and that would save our program money. So I would love it if we had a bilateral tax treaty. So please, promote that in D.C. if you get a chance.
Yeah, demographic. That's a great question. Yes, like Harris mentioned before the election day, the multiple survey institutions they release the data. You can see clearly young generation, especially under 35, under 40s, 60, 70% or even higher, under 30, it's even higher percentage vote for or support DPP, support President Tsai Ing-wen. And above 40, then it's like 50, 50, 60, 70s, it's kind of leaning toward like KMT. But the pattern, the picture doesn't look good for KMT if they don't do any reform and if they don't really pay attention to the young generation. I think KMT is in trouble. At this moment is in trouble, but they try to get rid of some old guys. So we'll see. But as I said, Taiwan really needs opposition party. That's the key argument. I think that's, even if you don't like KMT at this moment, you still have to consider who will be the opposition party. That's a very important thing for a strong or mature democracy to have. So you also mentioned Hakka. Hakka and also indigenous people, they used to support KMT, but after I don't know the full name for this committee, Ill-Gotten Party Asset Settlement Committee. After they set up this committee, it's a party, it's a department, it's a minister of this, a committee. So after setting up this, the KMT basically lose all his property. So he loses the property also means they don't have the money to support their roots. They used to have like local branch to support indigenous people, Hakka people. So they provide like education, healthcare, something for the really rural area. So they buy into this. They buy with KMT for a long period of time. After losing all the property, all the financial support, they of course find other way, and DPP step in. It's great. I mean, the government just try to help, and they realize, oh, the DPP also care about them, so they kind of reconsider who they vote for, who should they vote for. So that changed. But it's interesting if you look at Hsinchu. If you look at the Hsinchu area, the high tech, the industrial, area, they support the economic, pro-China or pro-economic development. So in Hsinchu, it's very still very blue at this moment. Even young people in Hsinchu, they're still blue. For the last questions from the Director General, I have a different point of view, how to promote Taiwan and U.S. relations. As a college professor at a teaching university, I think bringing more American students to Taiwan during the summer, have a study abroad trip in Taiwan really matters. I've been doing this for 5 consecutive years. The first group of people, the first group of my students, 2 of them actually now work for a State Department. And they are for Taiwan. They are die-hard Taiwan fans. They always support. Well, if you go to Taiwan, you love Taiwan. It's very simple. It's easy. It's just sell it. Instead of, I'm not saying the FTA or the high-end fancy treaty are not important. Those are important. But most importantly, it's grassroots diplomacy. If you make American young generation believe Taiwan is a place they should pay attention to, that would be different. Or using my personal experience, I taught at different university from rural area to urban area. Doesn't matter as long as they are young Americans. If they are into international relations, we should take them to Taiwan. Take a look at Taiwan. And then they love, when they back to the United States, they remember. Of course, we invite congressmen, politicians, like a sophisticated politician to Taiwan. Good for us. They will say something for us. But those young generation will do something for us. That's a big difference. The politicians, they are savvy enough to always say something nice to us. We appreciate it. But more importantly, if we have people in their 20s, they love Taiwan from the bottom of their heart, they will do everything. I have students now teaching English in Taiwan. I set up the study abroad program. I set up the teaching English for Taiwan program for the, as a college professor. That's what I can do. And I hope I can get support from, MOFA. It's hard. I mean, I can tell you this, it's difficult. It's difficult to get support. because it takes time. For politicians, for diplomats, you like to take pictures. I understand, I get that. But why not take pictures with young Americans? That's the thing. I feel really pumped when my students show me, the Taiwan flag, when they show me that they care about Taiwan. That's something we need to do if you really care about Taiwan's future. If you really like to, get a closer tie with the U.S., we have to look into like 10 years, 20 years, not just for now, for this election, for this politician, for this government. We have to look into like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. How many Americans will support Taiwan? Look at the Chicago Council's survey. Only 30-something% of people, willing to support Taiwan, whereas 60% American people support Japan, South Korea. Why? Japan, South Korea are more important, probably, but Taiwan is important too. The thing is, we have to make them believe Taiwan is important. How? The young generation. Start from young generation. Start from the college students. That will make a huge difference. It just takes time, but it's worth it. Also consider the Confucius Institute. They're not here yet already. They were out. I mean, I think it's for us. I mean, we share the same value, and we can easily convince American universities. Now Taiwan can help. If you like to learn Chinese, go to Taiwan. If you like to learn Chinese culture or Taiwanese culture, Asian culture, go to Taiwan. It's a safe place. Go to Taiwan. You can have your Facebook.
Not only old people are on Facebook. So, with respect to the indigenous, so transitional justice has largely been seen with dealing with the martial law era, but of course, Tsai's government has also been trying to deal with the past with the indigenous population. She actually apologized, and so it'll be interesting to see if there's more efforts. There's courts that are special to indigenous issues, and they're trying to train the judges so they actually know something about the areas in which they're being judges. But I'll be interested to see if she can make inroads that way. With respect to this last question, I think, I kind of see it as right now Americans support Taiwan for there's three big reasons: the values, defense, and just anti-China sentiment. So with values, I think this needs to be emphasized more and getting out there. And this news cycle was better than 4 years ago about telling the story about democracy in Taiwan. And we were watching the counting of the votes in the elementary school because it's public. I don't know, I put on Twitter like a 7-second video of, Hanguyu, are all silence, and it's kind of like 100,000 views or something, That's what people need to see, is people are counting votes in elementary school with like the 80-year-old grandma looking on to make sure they're not missing a count for Hanguyu, right? And, so that's great. And so, I think Minister Wu, Joseph Wu's at Wajabu, MOFA's Twitter game is strong, but sometimes too strong. I'm more of a Michelle Obama, where they go low, we go high. So I think when his rhetoric gets into the literally the commie bastards, that's not helping. I think that there needs to be a way to project that power and get out there with it without getting into the snark with Beijing, because that's not what I think is really helping Taiwan. With defense, it's in the U.S.'s interest not to have China be able to launch submarines from Hualien and have a deep water port from which those submarines disappear. Right now, if submarines get launched from the PRC, they're pretty easy to spot because it's shallow. If you get out to the first island chain, if you get out to Taiwan, those suckers disappear much faster. So I think there's smart people in the defense industry in the US who understand this intimately. But I don't think that more Americans understand that if we're so concerned about the islands in the South China Sea, about forced projection of the PLA Navy, we need to really also realize the sort of Taiwan as a natural aircraft carrier or something, that's important for more Americans to understand, because some Americans aren't going to care about the values. And third, I worry sometimes because some, especially the people in Congress who are pro-Taiwan, I feel like it's more they're anti-China. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they don't know much about Taiwan, they just don't like China. And that's not the best friends for Taiwan long term. So yeah, we need to get more people studying Chinese there. And we also, I'm amazed there's not better resort infrastructure. I took my family to Honolulu, the archipelago. It's beautiful. The hotels were awful. Like, you know, I mean, Americans go to Thailand. That's even further, right? Like, you need to get people there and think of it as a place. So there's other ways to think about how do you get people there for tourism? How do you get them there to study? And, you know, that's not complicated legal scholarship. That's just once people are literally step foot in Taiwan, they have a great time. The reporters from Beijing who came over, their eyes were like this the whole time. We had this rooftop party, there's like the New York Times filing their story. The reporters in Beijing were like, no one cares that we're up here, a bunch of journalists, you know, activists hanging out. This is amazing. Like, Taiwan has that, and that's special. And I think when people see it, they recognize it.
So it is now just past 8 o'clock, and I did promise, especially our two very jet-lagged scholars, that they could sleep in bed tonight. So this is something that I will hold to my promise. So if you have any last words for our audience, we can go and just spend like a minute on that. Otherwise, no? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight.